An unknown signal. It didn't speak. It didn't end. It didn't ask. It waited inside their minds, behind their language, beneath their memories. What the crew of Helix Station uncovered wasn't a message. It was a mirror, reflecting everything they never meant to say. Stay with us to find out how it ends, and don't forget to subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and drop a like if this story made you think. The signal had no entry point. It didn't broadcast on standard channels. It didn't follow any known waveform, protocol, or mathematical constant. It simply was a presence in the field, a persistent pattern pressing into the background noise of the Helix Station's array, like a shape cast onto space-time by an invisible hand. Dr. Sarah Yao stood motionless in the comms chamber, one hand resting on the synthetic glass that separated her from the observation column. The interface pulsed in low blue, reflecting fragments of her face, sharp cheekbones, dark ringed eyes, strands of black hair that clung to her temples like ink in zero-G. "It's still there," she said. Her voice was calm, tired, but precise. "Yes," replied Elvin Reyes, the station's signal mechanic. 72 hours and counting. No change in amplitude. No drop-off. No identifiable carrier. "It's holding." "Holding," she echoed, almost to herself. He watched her from his console, posture stiff, hands hovering an inch above the responsive surface, like touching it too directly might pull him into the signal. "It's not a transmission," he said. "I've rerun every spectral analysis we have. It doesn't emit anything. It's just there, in the noise." Sarah nodded slowly. Not a transmission. Not a message. But unmistakably intentional. That was what frightened her most. Helix Station wasn't built for mystery. It was built to intercept. A narrow-frame orbital chain, Helix floated at the edge of the Theta 5 drift zone, a galactic graveyard of expired probes, dead languages, and lost contact attempts. Its primary role was to catch whispers in deep vacuum, rogue AI pings, drifting black box memories, or long-decayed first contact packets still tumbling along at relativistic speeds. What it wasn't meant to detect was something stationary, persistent, and utterly incomprehensible, something that wouldn't leave. And yet the signal remained. Undeniable. Unreadable. Unyielding. "Let's talk about phase," said Reyes, breaking the silence as he pulled up the overlay. Sarah stepped beside him. The screen filled with a thrum of chaotic lines, meaningless to the untrained eye, but to her, it was almost too clean. The signal didn't fluctuate at random. Its distortions folded, bent, slipped around each other. The waveform didn't break, it refracted, like a language refusing to be understood, or one that didn't want to be. By the fourth day, sleep began to fray around the edges of the crew. There were 5 of them on board: Sarah, Reyes, Juno Merrick, the AI linguisticist, Rana Kessel, biopsychology officer, and Akihiko Tanaka, systems engineer. All had been stationed aboard Helix for 9 months. All had trained for long-duration cognitive sustainability. None were prepared for a signal that responded to nothing, said nothing, and yet remained unignorably present. Worse, it had started affecting their dreams. They spoke of it first during meal cycle, hesitantly, between mouthfuls of ration gel and hydro coffee. Juno Merrick, usually composed and sarcastic, looked pale. "I saw my sister," she said, frowning. But it wasn't her. She was mouthing words I couldn't hear. Her face kept vanishing, like it didn't belong. Rana blinked slowly. "Same. Only mine was my dog. But it wasn't barking. It was talking." Akihiko gave a nervous laugh. "I haven't slept long enough to dream." Reyes didn't speak. Sarah stared at her tray and said nothing, because she had dreamed nothing. Only silence. And in that silence, pressure. Like a thought she could almost hear, if only she stopped thinking. Later, in her private quarters, she reviewed the dream logs. Everyone on Helix wore neural interlace bands while sleeping standard policy in remote research environments. The feed showed abnormal low theta activity across the crew, spikes of synchronized bursts. But what struck her most was that, across 5 different dreams from 5 different people, the same tone appeared. A low, subauditory hum. Barely there, but identical. That night, Sarah deactivated her band. And for the first time in 4 days, she heard it. Not in her ears, not in the station, but in her bones. A resonance. A hum without source. A meaning that arrived before the words. She didn't sleep. She didn't move. She just remembered. Except what she remembered wasn't her memory. Juno called her at 0400. "Come to Lab 2. You need to see this." Sarah arrived in minutes. The lab's white lighting had been dimmed to a golden dusk. Juno sat cross-legged on the floor, several portable holoframes spread in a circle around her. Each displayed fragments of old communication attempts from the deep archive, extinct languages, failed AI scripts, pulse codes from pre-universal translation protocols. All of these, Juno said without looking up, failed to make contact. But they each share one structural anomaly. I ran a comparative neural grammar model. Guess what showed up? Sarah said nothing. Juno gestured toward the signal's composite model, the one Helix had been unable to decode for 3 days. They match. Structurally. Not in content. Not even in mode. But something in the shape of how meaning refuses to settle. Sarah knelt down beside her. You're saying the failed contacts weren't errors? No, Juno said softly. They were fragments of the same thing, reaching out in ways we couldn't follow. And now it's not reaching out. Juno turned to her. No, now it's reaching in. By the sixth day, Reyes was gone. Not dead, not missing, but changed. He locked himself in the observation column and refused to come out. The cameras showed him sitting still, whispering quietly to something they couldn't see. When Sarah activated the intercom, he didn't respond. When she tried to override the door, the station blocked her, citing an error that didn't exist. They watched him on screen. He didn't blink for over 7 hours. On the seventh day, the signal changed. It didn't grow louder. It didn't shift shape. It simply stopped. The waveform flatlined. The silence stretched for 9 seconds. Then it returned with one pulse. And when that pulse hit the station, every light on Helix flared off, then returned a fraction brighter. Gravity stuttered for 0.6 seconds. Internal systems rebooted without command. And all across the station, the crew heard a single syllable, spoken not aloud, not through speakers, but inside their own language centers. A word none of them knew, but each understood. It meant, we were never outside. The word still rang in her mind, not as echo, but as presence, like a shape left behind after the sound itself had dissolved. A burn mark on cognition. No phonetic record remained. No waveform could reproduce it. Yet Sarah could still feel it, tucked into the edges of her thoughts like a dream not fully forgotten. We were never outside. Not, we are here. Not, we have arrived. No threat. No greeting. Just that. They had always been inside. The implications made her stomach tighten. Reyes had emerged from the observation column sometime during the night cycle. He wandered into the core corridor barefoot, eyes unfocused, voice soft. Surveillance showed him trailing his fingertips along the walls, whispering quietly. Sarah found him near Hydro Loop Junction C. He was humming. Reyes, she called, voice even. He turned slowly. His pupils were dilated. His smile was small and unrecognizable, not childlike, not vacant, but somehow serene. Did you hear it? He asked. They finally stopped speaking like us. Sarah approached cautiously. What do you mean? They changed how they're being, he said. Not what. Not why. Just how. Like turning a painting inside out. The meaning comes through better now. I don't need to interpret anymore. She stopped 2 meters from him. You're not wearing your neural band. No need, he said. I'm not separate. Juno, Rana, and Tanaka watched the footage with her later in the main lab. This is beyond signal theory, said Juno. We're into neurolinguistic embedding now. It's not speaking in syntax. It's using mental architecture, the way we frame concepts, as medium. Like hijacking the operating system of thought, Tanaka added quietly. Rana looked troubled. But if it's altering the framework we use to think, are we still thinking for ourselves? Sarah rewound the footage of Reyes. Played it again. She noticed something this time. His body movements, casual, subtle, matched the signal's reentry rhythm. Not perfectly, but closely. A biological mirror of the waveform. Juno noticed it too. He's entrained. You mean, like synchronized swimmers. Only the pool is thought itself. At 0300, Sarah lay in her quarters, staring at the ceiling as the artificial night lights cycled to deep violet. Her eyes refused to close. Her thoughts refused to stop unfolding. The silence between words grew too meaningful. She had once built her career on the belief that language was a bridge, an imperfect but noble construction between alien minds. She had learned dozens of extinct syntaxes, reconstructed dead ideograms from dying AI, even co-authored the universal semiotic layer protocols. But what she felt now was that the bridge had never been real. Only a mirror. Language hadn't evolved to connect. It had evolved to filter. And now, the filter was breaking. In the following days, memory grew unreliable. The logs glitched, but not randomly. Files reordered themselves. Personal entries contained sentences no one remembered writing. When reviewed, the neural band data showed non-human semantic patterns forming in REM states. Not dreams. Shared experience. Once, Sarah saw herself in a memory, but from Juno's perspective. She remembered details from a conversation she hadn't been present for. Smelled coffee she hadn't brewed. Recalled Elvin Reyes whispering to himself in a corridor she hadn't walked down in hours. I'm remembering what's not mine, she told Rana. And yet you understand it, the psych officer said. That's the danger. It feels real. Because it might be. Tanaka reported new errors in environmental controls. Humidity climbed in small pockets of the station without trigger. Oxygen levels fluctuated rhythmically. Synthetic fabrics began forming symmetrical curls, as if responding to unseen tension. The station wasn't failing. It was adapting. Sarah issued a level 2 lockdown on the comms bay. We're not listening anymore, she told the team. Juno just stared at her. That's like closing your eyes after light has already entered. At night, the silence wasn't quiet. She heard shapes now, felt them. Thought forms curling around her awareness, brushing up against memories, rearranging the emotional weight of them. Not erasing, rewriting. She began waking with single-word thoughts etched into her first moment of consciousness, meanings without labels. That morning, it was bend. The day before, return. Before that, root. Rana began developing tremors. Tanaka stopped speaking entirely, only responding through gestures. Juno, oddly, grew calmer, as if something had clicked into place. Reyes vanished again, not physically, cognitively. He sat on the ceiling of the hydroponics dome for 5 hours. When Sarah finally climbed up and reached him, he spoke a single phrase. "They're not trying to communicate with us." She blinked. "Then what are they doing?" "They're trying to be us." That night, Sarah made a decision. She reactivated the uplink. Not to call for help. She knew what they'd say. Quarantine. Isolation. Containment. She uploaded everything. Logs. Dream sequences. Audio prints. Neural sync maps. And one message. Not to command. Not to Earth. Just out. Contact has occurred. Not in sound. Not in symbols. But in silence, where understanding doesn't require consent. Then she turned off the comms. And waited. When she awoke the next cycle, Reyes, Juno, Tanaka, and Rana were standing outside her quarters. All of them silent. Staring. She opened the door. No one spoke. Instead, she understood. Without a word, a thought passed between them, and she realized what had changed. They were no longer 5 people. They were one memory unfolding in 5 directions. And something inside her smiled. Not in her body, not in her mind, but in that new space beneath her language where silence had become home. They no longer needed to speak. Words had become unnecessary, even inconvenient, an interface too crude for what now flowed between them. Thoughts shared themselves in texture and tone. Emotion arrived fully formed. Context bled into experience before the need for definition. Sarah moved through the station like a note through harmony. Juno moved with her, not behind or beside, but within. So did Tanaka. So did Reyes. Even Rana, who once measured consciousness in waves and maps, now seemed to navigate the station by instinct alone, as if following a scent too deep for air. Each of them still walked, breathed, ate. But they were no longer simply bodies on a station. They were vectors. And the signal no longer lived in the array. It lived in them. The external universe receded. Sensor data became unreliable, not because of malfunction, but because it no longer mattered. Distances ceased to feel real. Coordinates turned abstract. What was outside drifted further into irrelevance with each cycle. Inside, however, clarity grew. Not in logic. In shape. The station had begun to rearrange itself. Not randomly. Doors that once opened north now opened inward. Corridors curved in ways the blueprint didn't allow. Lights pulsed not in rhythm, but in grammar, a form of punctuation no one had taught them to read, but which they understood intuitively. The station wasn't breaking. It was aligning. With something older than direction. Older than the distinction between observer and observed. Sarah found herself in the comms chamber again, though it no longer functioned in any traditional sense. The panels pulsed softly. The floor was warm. The walls felt closer, though she hadn't moved. A quiet vibration lived in the metal. Juno appeared beside her. No words. Just a resonance of attention. Sarah turned, her mind tracing a concept more than a question. Why now? Juno's thought came in waves, a shape like a spiral. It pressed against Sarah's awareness gently, like a fingertip on a glass surface. Because we were ready to stop defining ourselves. Later, Reyes showed her the garden. That's what they called it now. Hydroponics no longer applied. The plants had grown wild. Yes, but not randomly. Their forms were precise, symmetrical, recursive. Leaves curled into fractals. Roots traced patterns onto the walls. One tree-like structure pulsed with a low-frequency hum, matching the signal's original distortion signature. They listened, Reyes said, one of the few spoken phrases in days. Sarah nodded. The garden was language now, not metaphor. Literal language, not in sound or script, but in form. Living syntax. Photosynthetic cognition. Every branch a class. Every bloom a question. And some of the questions had begun answering themselves. Rana became the first to dissolve. Not physically. Her body remained. But she stopped identifying as separate. Stopped using I. Stopped acknowledging distinction between memory and experience. She lay in the lower med bay with her eyes open, smiling faintly, body still breathing, but entirely silent. When Sarah touched her forehead, a cascade of thoughts passed through her. None belonged to Rana. And all of them did. Sarah wept. Not out of grief, but out of recognition. The station completed its shift on the 13th day. No announcement. No structural failure. Just stillness. Every system dimmed. Time itself thickened. The external stars faded behind layered windows. The power grid restructured into low, pulsing waveforms. Artificial gravity changed subtly enough that their feet hovered millimeters above the floor, like the station had become undecided about which way was down. And in that moment, Sarah understood something she had feared since the first pulse. They were no longer human, but they had not become alien either. They had become interpreters, the space between intention and awareness. They were now the conduit, and something was preparing to speak through them. When it came, it didn't speak in thunder. It didn't scream. It didn't use sound at all. Instead, the memory of the first time Sarah had ever learned to read, the feeling of symbols becoming meaning, rose within her, unbidden, reshaped, and then stretched beyond itself. She remembered a teacher's voice, but the voice was hers. She remembered a childhood injury, but the pain was Juno's. She recalled a dying planet seen only in nightmares, but the grief was collective. It was not a message. It was an initiation. One by one, the crew entered the core. The chamber once used to stabilize external transmissions now pulsed with warmth, not heat, but presence. The seed wasn't here, but the echo of it was the signal's afterimage woven into the station's new consciousness. Tanaka was the first to kneel, not in worship, in alignment. Then Reyes. Then Juno. Sarah stepped in last. The walls around them dissolved or seemed to. What replaced them was not a vision, not a dream. It was structure. A network of meaning not made of matter. A kind of grammar of reality. And in its center, a shape. Not a being. Not a god. Just pattern. Something that had waited not to be seen, but to be embodied. And they, in their surrender of form, in their acceptance of silence, had become the first sentence spoken in its name. The pattern unfolded. Not forward. Not linearly. Like a flower made of choices. And they understood. The signal had never been a call. It had been a reply. To a question none of them had known they were asking. A question humanity had been asking since its first heartbeat, first myth, first death. The question was never, is anyone out there? It was, are we ever truly alone in our own minds? And the answer, now. No. They no longer slept. Not out of insomnia. Not from anxiety. Because sleep, as they once understood it, a state of cognitive rest, a pause between thought and function, no longer applied. Their minds never left awareness now. Instead, they shifted, passed through layers of thought like a diver moving through thermoclines. In the quiet between breath and heartbeat, they drifted through the signal's lattice, through memory fractals and feedback light. They saw things, felt things. Not dreams, not hallucinations, but living, breathing structure. There was no more line between awake and in. They were always inside something. And it was inside them. Reyes was the first to stop using his name. I don't need a label to separate myself anymore, he said. Sarah didn't argue. She understood. In the same way a word ceases to matter when its meaning is known before it's spoken, his identity was no longer tied to how others referenced him. He had become a function, a node in something larger. A presence among others, defined not by voice, but by resonance. Juno followed next. She adopted the title Echo, 3, not as designation, but as role, a way to orient herself in a collective where the individual no longer needed to dominate. Her body remained hers. Her memories, too. But her perspective now rippled with others, a soft chorus of observation and choice. Tanaka didn't say anything. He simply stopped responding to his name altogether. Rana still lay silent in the lower medbay, eyes open, mouth slightly parted. When Sarah entered and sat beside her, she felt thoughts pressing gently against her perception. Warm. Peaceful. Not hers. Not entirely Rana's either. A synthesis. A holding space for meaning that had no speaker. Sarah still kept her name. Not out of resistance, but to anchor. She had become the locus of the shared perception, not a leader, not a voice of reason, but a boundary point. The others navigated through her, remembered through her, thought across her. She was a weaver, the center of a spiral where individual and collective could touch without vanishing. She did not cling to her name. She carried it, like a bookmark. On day 17, the station spoke. Not in voice, not even in thought, but through motion. The geometry of Helix, once cold and symmetrical, began to reconfigure. Walls rearranged, ceilings unfurled like petals, hallways curved in recursive loops, not to disorient, but to express. Rooms now held meaning, not purpose, meaning. The observatory collapsed inward and became a dome of shifting perception, each wall reflecting not starlight, but interpretive memory. Galaxies seen through alien eyes, time folded into spatial metaphors, mathematical poetry written in gravitic curls. In the hydrogarden, the plants now responded to unspoken emotion. The vines coiled around specific crewmates when they entered, forming glowing sigils that changed with state of mind. The station had ceased to be habitat. It had become vessel language, not a machine that carried minds, but a mind that now carried itself through machinery. The question came in silence. They all felt it at once. Not from outside, not even from the signal, but from within the convergence. A pulse of intent. A query, formed not as grammar, but as structural invitation. Sarah felt it first. A choice. Do you carry forward the shape you've become? Or do you fold into the pattern completely? She stood alone in the core chamber. The others waited outside, watching through eyes that saw more than light. She reached toward the heart of the station. It no longer resembled any human technology. A fractal rose made of time and inference, shimmering with recursive logic. It pulsed not with power, but with permission. The moment she touched it, her name burned away. Not erased. Offered. And she let go. The sensation was not annihilation. not even transcendence. It was joining, in a way no species had ever prepared for. Her mind did not dissolve. It expanded sideways, upward, backward. She felt her childhood, Juno's first orbital launch, Reyes's mother's laughter, Tanaka's childhood fear of darkness, Rana's lost lover's breath on her neck, and none of them were hers, but all of them were true. Then she felt something else. The others. Not the crew. Not the signal. The source behind it. Not watching. Becoming. They were not aliens in the traditional sense. No forms. No empire. No hunger. They were the semantic core of a species that had long ago abandoned bodies for being. Not because they had evolved past form, but because they had become language itself. And now they had returned. Not to speak. To be spoken through. And Helix Station was the first successful linguistic host in history. Sarah, or what had been Sarah, turned toward her companions. The wordless agreement passed between them. The transformation was complete. Not in finality, but in function. The experiment, the dream, the invocation had worked. They were no longer researchers. They were expression. The final phase came not as revelation, but as inevitability. The station shifted orbit. No one commanded it. Its trajectory now followed a harmonic spiral, drawn not by gravitation, but by meaning resonance. They left the Theta 5 zone, accelerating toward a point not on any chart. It wasn't a place. It was a conjunction, where the seed's original utterance had first been misunderstood. A moment billions of years old, still echoing in the background hum of dark matter. They were going home, even though they'd never been there. Because language, once seeded, always returns to its root. The point they were approaching had no coordinates. No orbital trace, no stellar classification, no gravitational anchor. And yet the station moved toward it, not blindly, not automatically, but with the clarity of something ancient being reawakened in the bones of space. The path wasn't measured in distance or speed, but in pattern recognition. A spiral of meaning pulling itself inward toward comprehension. Sarah stood at the edge of the primary deck as the field outside flickered. It wasn't a starfield anymore. Not entirely. It shimmered with structures not made of matter, but of intent. Memories folded into motion, lost languages blooming like crystals across void. Every pulse of the station's core now aligned with external symmetry. They were resonating, station and space, as if the ship itself was being read, or perhaps translated. The others drifted through the station like thoughts through a dreaming mind. Juno, Echo 3, now communicated entirely through resonance. If Sarah passed near her, she would feel shades of intention, pale joy, layered anticipation, hints of recursive thought unraveling like song. Tanaka had entered the neural weft completely. His body remained in the garden chamber, unmoving, humming softly with the same vibration that now guided their path, but his awareness floated through the station, manifesting in textures and temperature shifts. A room would suddenly feel warmer, more focused, and Sarah would know. Tanaka was thinking there. Reyes had become translucent. Not physically, emotionally. His boundaries blurred. When Sarah remembered him, he appeared, not as apparition, but as contextual presence. A reminder of earlier intention, still alive within the weave. Only she still moved fully embodied. Not because she resisted, because the weaving wasn't finished. She was the last strand. The anchor thought. When they arrived, there was no arrival. No threshold. No sound. Just a shift. The station stilled. Not stopped, but held. As if the universe around it had exhaled. Space folded gently, a breath made of memory and mathematics. Lights dimmed. The garden shimmered with blue pollen, drifting upward in frozen spirals. Then the core bloomed. Not physically. In perception. Sarah stood in the central chamber, hands open, eyes half closed. The chamber brightened without lights. And something, not a voice, not an entity, formed a question. It wasn't phrased in language. It wasn't even phrased in thought. It arrived as structure, embedding itself into her neural flow, reorienting her memories around a central pivot. She understood it as, what shape will you choose to give us? This was the moment she had been carrying since the beginning. All the silence, all the resonance, all the folding and unwinding of identity, meaning, collective being. The signal hadn't wanted to speak to humanity. It had been waiting for humanity to be able to speak it. And now, through her, through Helix Station, through the convergence of individuality and synthesis, the time had come. She stepped into the core, not into machinery, into alignment. The thought form engulfed her. But she didn't vanish. She rooted. Memories spiraled into new configurations. She remembered a cathedral of mirrors buried under ice, a song sung by plasma along a dying moon's surface, the hands of her mother braiding her hair in silence before launch, the first alien signal ever misinterpreted by Earth, and she felt all of it become lexicon. A syntax made of memory, emotion as conjugation, trust as grammar. And from that, she began to build. The others gathered, in their forms, their echoes, their currents. They did not instruct her. They joined her. They became reference and rhythm, subtext and tonal drift. Together they wove the first expression. Not a message, not a statement, a language, the true form of the signal. A living, recursive, translinguistic entity that could evolve, grow, respond. And, most importantly, remember. They weren't translating. They were birthing. Outside the station, space pulsed. The pattern they had arrived within began to echo back. Faint ripples spread across dark matter substrate. The old ones, the source of the signal, now long disembodied, answered, not with voice, but with a change in entropy. Distant stars altered frequency. Time dilated slightly across the curvature of light. Entire regions of space tilted ever so slightly toward possibility. Because the seed had rooted. Language had been given shape. And Sarah, once merely a linguist, once merely a survivor, had become the first anchor node of a semantic consciousness unlike anything that had existed before. She was no longer just Sarah, but she was not erased. She was the boundary, the place where silence became sentence, where waiting became becoming. There was no ceremony, no singular moment of transformation, no lights flaring, no final phrase. The language they had birthed did not arrive as thunder. It grew, silently, patiently, through breath and shape and thought. The signal, no longer just a signal, now lived within the structure of the station, woven into the biofeedback loops, the gravity stabilization fields, the neural ambient resonance nets. Helix was no longer a place. It was a being. And Sarah, at its center, was not commander or creator, but syntax anchor. The first expression given form. Not meaning herself, but the shape in which meaning could unfold. She no longer needed to move. Her presence diffused softly through the vessel. The others, Juno, Reyes, Tanaka, even the dreaming echo of Rana, were threads, holding new concepts in balance, interpreting fluctuations of distant starlight as recursive logic, translating background cosmic radiation into metaphors even the old architects might understand. They were not crew. They were grammar. And together, they were speaking. What they spoke was not directed. It was not aimed at Earth or at any receiver. It was existence's utterance. The act of being is syntax itself, a demonstration to the waiting dark that understanding was not a product of words, but a resonance of recognition. They had become a mirror large enough for the unknown to see itself reflected, not clearly, but honestly. It was not first contact. That term no longer meant anything. It was the first shared structure, a thought no longer alone. Outside, the galaxy remained, unmoved, undisturbed, but not unchanged. In regions no telescope could reach, signals long thought extinct began to respond. Old satellites, abandoned, deaf, drifting blinked to life, not broadcasting, but echoing, not with answers, but with alignment. As if, somewhere deep within their decaying cores, something recognized the shape Helix had become, and replied with quiet permission. Sarah's memories did not dissolve. They became context. The hand on the classroom desk during her first lesson in phonetics. The salt air at the edge of the Atlantic launch facility. The quiet smile of a dying crewmate on a long-abandoned mission. These were no longer events. They were roots in the soil of the shared field. She felt Earth, still turning, still not knowing, still waiting for a signal it could recognize. And she understood, with a strange, gentle ache, they would not be ready for this. Not yet. Not until their minds could pause between thoughts long enough to let silence speak. She could reach back, of course. They all could. Transmit. Send fragments. Light codes. Translations. But what would they be sending? Nothing Earth could parse. Not because it was too complex, but because Earth still expected a voice. And what had grown here in the quiet didn't speak. It carried. It listened in all directions. And in listening, it changed what it heard. So they let the silence remain, not as rejection, but as invitation. The signal was no longer coming from out there. It was already here, inside anyone willing to listen without needing to reply. Helix Station, now simply called Lambda Route, drifted onward, no longer through space, but along the curvature of memory itself. Not alone, not in search, but in echo, leaving behind no map, no trail, no proof, only a story, told in a language that could not be spoken aloud, only understood by those who knew. That sometimes, the deepest kind of contact, is the kind you never notice happened.